Hey, everybody, welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you today. Hope that you're having a great day, getting ready for a wonderful weekend as we move into Holy Week. Let us begin to be whole. Let us really celebrate this time in which three of the three of the largest, some three of the most greatly observed religions in the world. It seems that our high holy times coincide. And, I am a member of the Christian faith, so we're moving into Holy Week as we really ruminate over the lessons of Christ. And I hope that whether you are in this faith or not, I hope that you will be blessed. And I hope that these lessons that were taught in this season can be absorbed by everyone. We've got to learn to love. We've got to uh, act. We've got to make the world not just a better place. We need to make the world the right place. I'm Santita Jackson. I want you to join me today as we talk about our democracy. Many people are so concerned about it now, more concerned about really, let's back this up, not the democracy, the republic, because we're a constitutional republic that has democratic elements. And do we really understand what a republic is? Do we really understand what democracy is? Do we understand that there are forces that have always sought to not have a republic? That was a big fight several hundred years ago. Should we be a monarchy or should we be a republic? We went back and forth. There were even some founding fathers who wanted George Washington to be a king. He said, no, no, no. We just had that fight. I will be a president. And going forward, that is what we will have. And as we have settled into this republic, as we have embraced democracy, more or less, we have to look at the forces that fight against it. And far too often it has been the far right. And there is a book, and I hope that you will get it, Anti-Democratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. Now, we first heard of Dave DALEY, who has been a senior fellow with Fair Vote, someone who's really the ultimate patriot, with his book Rat Effed, The True Story of the Secret Plan to Steal Our Democracy. This something my father just loved trying to stumble over it. It was hilarious as we would have him on radio and have him at our Saturday morning forum at our convention. And then you had Unrigged. Americans are fighting back to save this democracy, but we need to step back and look at why it is that we take 2 steps forward and sometimes 3 steps back. No, you're not crazy. If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And some people have put a plan in place to undermine all that keeps us free. It is a plan. And really, you can see it embodied, David DALEY, in the trajectory of John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And I appreciate the way you began the book. I mean, you helped us to really see just how much racism, which is a form of classism, is really at the heart of what we're dealing here in America. And what we're dealing with all over the world. But everybody looks to the United States because there's so much hope vested in our country, right? But I want you to take me to who John Roberts is. Let me just read the beginning of the book, because I did something, you all, that I never do. I actually downloaded the book first onto my Kindle because I'm so eager to get it, but it was just delivered. I just got a text that it was just delivered to my building, and I cannot wait to get it. But this is in your introduction. It was a line no one could see, the invisible boundary wrapped around a new Walmart, bisected Interstate 65 in the very center of Alabama, the state at the heart of the fight for the ballot, and stretched the Calera City Council district that Ernest Montgomery represented away from the city's growing downtown. Montgomery's home district was now severed from a black church and neighborhood and pushed toward wealthy new subdivisions between highways 22 and 31. It would not take long for the political consequences of this line to be seen. Montgomery, just the second official Black elected in this city's history, in this county's history, represented the council's only majority Black district. The invisible line turned his district from 71% Black to nearly 70% white. How did that happen? And it seems that it's happening over and over again, all over the place. Are we seeing it disproportionately impact Black people? Of course. But Latinos are underrepresented. And philosophies, not just phenotypes, not just what we look like, Dave Daley. I'm looking at this razor-thin margin in the House of Representatives. And they are trying to cull this legislation so that they can protect it from the Senate. And then we've got a Democratic seat that's open, that will be open for the rest of the year, essentially, in Texas. The Democrats aren't talking about it. The Republicans are playing a game to keep a reliably Democratic seat from being seated in the House of Representatives. All of this stuff is going on, but how did this particular seat, this district, get flipped from 71% Black to 70% white? And yes, I did pivot in my chair. When I read that, I said, wait a minute, I had to read it several times.
It's a long sentence.
It's a long sentence, but you know what? It's a long story.
Yes.
So how did this happen? And is this happening over and over and over and over again?
I start this book in Calera, Alabama, for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is Alabama has been at the very heart of the battle for voting rights for 200 years, if not longer. But this fight over a city council district that was redistricted from a Black majority seat to a white seat just as soon as a Black member won it, is really the beginning of a case called Shelby County versus Holder, which I think is probably the most consequential Supreme Court decision and perhaps one of the most far-reaching disasters that this court has handed down among its long history. The Shelby County versus Holder case is where John Roberts effectively put an end to preclearance, which was the most effective enforcement mechanism contained within the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, of course, is the legislation that attempted to make this nation a multiracial democracy really for the first time. It's the most important and successful civil rights legislation the country's ever had. And it followed decades, not only of Jim Crow across Alabama and the South, but it followed decades of federal efforts to put an end to that, which did not work. They were unsuccessful. And they were unsuccessful because resistance across these localities was stubborn, and it was happy to disobey federal law, in part because local sheriffs and local judges were on the side of the segregationists. So it was all very difficult to fix and change. And so preclearance says, if you're going to make any changes to the voting procedures or election law in these places where there's been this history of stubborn resistance, you're going to have to run it past the federal government or a neutral court in Washington, D.C. first. We're taking it out of the hands of the state legislature, out of the hands of local sheriffs, out of the hands of local judges. you who have proven time and again that you cannot be trusted are going to have to show your work if you want to make any of these changes. Alabama, of course, was covered under preclearance. John Roberts in the Shelby County case puts an end to it because he says things have changed in the South. We don't need this anymore. But the very question of Ernest Montgomery's district in Calera, Alabama, shows why John Roberts is so dangerously wrong and deluded, right? Because that district was redrawn, and local officials in Calera did not pre-clear the map. The law said that folks in Calera, if they wanted to redistrict, they had to take the new map to the Department of Justice first and prove that it was not discriminatory and didn't have any negative racial impacts. They ignored the law. They did not do it. That's not the first time Calera, Alabama ignored the law. The population of Calera that grew so much that this redistricting of Montgomery's seat was necessary for population growth. There were about 175 annexations in Calera between 1991 and 2006. I'll let you guess how many of those annexations the city of Calera submitted for pre-clearance approval by the Department of Justice. If you think the answer is 0 of 175, you would be correct. They did not submit any of them. So Calera, Alabama was ignoring the Voting Rights Act in the mid-2000s in the same way that made Voting Rights Act necessary in the first place, right? This was the reason why preclearance was there. And preclearance caught what happened. Because when Montgomery protested to the Department of Justice, they said, wait a second, you cannot hold a legal election on a non-pre-cleared map. And the Department of Justice put an end to this, and they forced that election to be rerun under the old districts. Montgomery was able to hold on to the seat that he lost. But when John Roberts takes a look at these facts, John Roberts says, oh, things have changed. We don't need this anymore. What happened in Calera was the very reason why we still needed this. Calera is not the only example of this. When the Congress of the United States in 2006 extended the Voting Rights Act and preclearance for another 25 years, and this was a Republican Congress, by the way, a Republican House, a Republican Senate, signed into law by President George W. Bush. It came with about a 15,000-page report that documented exactly why preclearance remained necessary to this day, that had reason after reason, just like these stories in Calera, that will make the hair on your arms stand up. Elections being canceled, precincts being moved at the last second, precincts being moved to locations in towns that had been the site of lynchings in the past, again and again and again and again. John Roberts was blind to all of this. John Roberts says, we don't need preclearance anymore. He put an end, and what we have seen for the last 13 years in a world without preclearance is exactly what happens when the guard is taken away from the prison door. All of the dark forces in American life that sit there under the surface, they are free to return and come back.
But this is the theme that goes through your books, correct?
Yes.
The far right said, you can have the presidency, please. What we'll do is take everything underneath the presidency. We'll take the Congress, but more than that, we're really going to focus on the states, because the states send everybody to Congress.
Right.
And so That's why you've got to get rat effed, everybody. Yep, it is Fucked. That's right, rat effed. It is.
Sorry about
And
that during Holy Week, everybody.
oh, hallelujah. And it is unrigged. But wait a minute, what is rat effing? Because I think people need to understand what that is.
Yeah, the title of that book is
Ooh.
attention grabbing, but it's really it's really a book about partisan gerrymandering. It's really a book about what the rock band AC/DC might have once referred to as a dirty deed done dirt cheap. And I won't sing it for you. I mean, because you all would change the station. But so it's really a book about redistricting, and it opens on the day that Barack Obama is elected president. And there is a sense in the nation that there is a new multiracial coalition that is going to be the majority in America for some time to come. And of course, it didn't exactly turn out that way, right? And it's because, in many ways, a handful of Republican strategists understood that as historic as 2008 might have been, 2010 could be much more consequential, because 2010 is a census year. And what we do after the census every year is we redistrict every state legislative district and congressional seat in the country to account for population changes. The idea here is to even things out and make it fair. But of course, when you have politicians in charge of this process, really what happens is they try to work it for their own advantage. And what Republicans understood was that if they could in 2010 mount really a stealth campaign to take over state legislatures in states that they might not ordinarily or previously have held, they would have the power to draw all of these state legislative and congressional lines themselves. And as technology and polarization increased, it became possible to draw lines that really you did not lose on for decades and electoral cycles to come. The lines that they drew back in 2011 in many states are still handing Republicans huge advantages, even in years when Democratic candidates win more votes. And all of this goes back to this electoral strategy called Red Map, the redistricting majority project that Republicans put in place in states like Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, North Carolina, Texas, Indiana, Alabama. They were able to draw themselves massive advantages in these states that have endured for a long, long time.
Well, which takes us, I mean, so essentially they decided we're going to rig the system.
That's right.
To your second book, Unrigged, because I think that Americans began to catch on to that. And we said, wait a minute, something, the math, as they say, the math ain't mathing, right? And which then takes us to needing to understand who the players are. I think that's so important. And the trajectory of Clarence Thomas's career is consequential because it's very much like John Roberts and Gorsuch, all of them, coming through the Federalist Society. It is a network and it's a pathway. Yeah. And so would you give us some background on John Roberts? I think we don't know enough about him. We don't know enough about these people who make these decisions about our lives that have such tremendous personal and political consequence. Who is he?
Right. I mean, in the same way that Republicans understood that state legislatures were the key building block if you wanted to cement authority within legislative chambers, Republicans also understood that the courts were extraordinarily important if you wanted to enforce policies and positions that did not have majorities among Americans. So if you wanted to achieve political and policy goals that you could not win at the ballot box, one way to do that would be to take over the courts. and enforce them that way. So if you look at, questions on gun control or reproductive rights, voting rights, the regulatory state, the question of presidential immunity, all things that majorities of Americans are very much not on the side that the U.S. Supreme Court has come down on, but the court effectively operates. What Republicans understood was that this court could operate in many ways as an unelected super legislature. Decisions unreviewable with judges appointed for life, and you could achieve an awful lot that way that you never could otherwise. Roberts, in many ways, is at the absolute heart of this as Chief Justice. And Roberts likes to suggest, and he's got a public persona that has been reinforced by, I would suggest, very lazy media coverage of him that suggests he's just a moderate conservative.
Is it lazy?
Notionalist.
Oh, I mean, no, because they shape a narrative. Because I've worked in news, and just as a contributor, but also having been from a family that's been the focus of news, you get to know how this works. They purposely and purposefully shape a narrative.
Yeah,
they hold stories. They sit on stories. And we have that's beginning to be very, very clear.
Yeah.
And to me, they're sitting on this story about who he is, like they sat on the story about the monies that the justices. Let me not get ahead of myself. And their wives have been taking. I mean,
no, it's very true.
They sit on Virginia Thomas. They sit on Thomas conflicts of interest. So just because he is this mild, moderate guy who balances the court, who really saves us from the far right, right?
John Roberts is not a moderate institutionalist. John Roberts, in many ways, you could not even call him Chief Justice. John Roberts is the most successful and important Republican politician and political operative of the last 25 years.
Oh, really?
Because what Robert has achieved on all of those topics we just rattled off, right? On reproductive rights, on campaign finance, on voting rights, on healthcare, on the regulatory state, on presidential power, on the environment and climate. What John Roberts has achieved by judicial fiat through the U.S. Supreme Court could never have been won by Republicans through any political process, for the reason that majorities of Americans take the other side on these questions. Roberts has transformed the nation and pushed the nation and the Constitution far to the right over the last 25 years. But he has done so slowly, right? We all know the old cliche about the frog in the pot. You can't just dump it into scalding water because the frog will jump out. But if you slowly boil the frog, it doesn't even know what's happening. And so John Roberts has acted and talked as if, oh, I'm just an umpire. I'm just calling balls and strikes. Whereas his decisions are not calling balls and strikes. They are rewriting the very rules of the game, changing the game to the benefit of his team, the side that appointed him to that position, that groomed him for this position over the course of his entire life. It is payday. And with Roberts, the conservative legal movement hit pay dirt.
Well, the payday. What is the Federalist Society? Who's Leo Leonard? I mean, there are some figures who are very prominent in this. These are the figures who make you a judge, who get you to become a federal judge. And they certainly, absolutely, that you are so vetted by the time you even come up for mention of the Supreme Court. But I think people need to understand that this is not this blind process, right?
Right.
This, I think it's.
We simply get a printout of the most qualified people.
No,
No,
no. So please
no.
help me to understand, because he is, to me,
Yeah.
he is really, he's emblematic of the system, because it's like he gamed it all the way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, Leonard Leo is
watching
probably the most consequential figure in American political life who we
Whoa.
don't know very much
You
about.
don't know anything about this guy.
Right? I mean, Leonard Leo emerges from the Federalist Society, which is probably the most successful nonprofit political organization in American history in many ways. It's founded in the early 1980s by conservatives who want to have more influence not only in the judiciary, but in law schools. And what they did was take a real long view. They looked at what the civil rights movement, what the consumer movement, what the anti-war movement had been able to build through the courts in the 1960s and the 1970s, that the big victories that the environmental and civil rights groups had won. And they said, well, why can't we do that? And what they realized was that they didn't have a lot of lawyers who agreed with them on their side. And that had to be built over time. And so the Federalist Society becomes the organizing group on law school campuses around the country. And it becomes a career network, a credentialing network. And as it grew and expanded into the 1990s, into the 2000s, it really became the vetting process by which anybody who wanted to move forward in the conservative legal movement, anybody who wanted jobs at certain law firms, anybody who wanted jobs on Republican judicial committees in Congress, anybody who wanted a job in the Department of Justice under a Republican administration, and certainly anybody who wanted to be considered for a federal judgeship, or these days, even a position on a state Supreme Court. The Federalist Society had to know you and approve of you. And in many cases, they were selecting the nominees and choosing the judges really themselves. And
so you're saying
Leonard Leo in the job of doing most of that himself. So much so, right, that in 2016, when Donald Trump looks like he's going to be the nominee for the Republican Party for president, and lots of conservatives don't really know Donald Trump, in order to build his credentials with conservatives, Donald Trump says to Leonard Leo and the Heritage Foundation, I will let you give me a list of approved judges for the U.S. Supreme Court. So really, it's Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society who in many ways created and handpicked and named the folks on the U.S. Supreme Court in those lifelong positions, making decisions for all the rest of us.
But stay right there, because I think that people need to understand that by the time these people come up,
right,
they have been vetted
for decades.
For decades, they are known entities. And quite frankly, in Washington, and you know Washington, David DALEY, I know Washington too. Everybody in Washington knows everybody.
Right.
I mean, that's why it's such a fiction when you look at these hearings. I'm like, everybody knows who these folks are. They know exactly who they are. They know exactly where they stand. You know where they stand on reproductive rights for women. You know where they stand on voting rights. They have their footprints are everywhere. They might not be footprints in the court, but they have been in these different organizations and societies. They have been brought through. And that's why, because in the first part of your book, I was struck by the first section, the long game, which to me goes to the 50-year plot. Because I took every word that you said very seriously, because I don't want people to just think you're a conspiracist.
No, not at all.
You know, what do they say? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. what do they say in the world of politics? They're acts of gods and conspiracies, nothing else. And so when you say it's a 50-year
I mean, I have the documents.
okay.
I mean, there's no conspiracy here when you have the documents and the memos, and you can see the entire strategy laid out in front of you. It's a very patient, strategic plan, and it paid off in ways that I would imagine even the organizers of these movements could never have imagined.
Well, okay, what is the plot? What were they trying to do? What have they done?
Well, really, what they wanted to do was find a way. Well, this book opens with something called the Powell Memo, which was written by a man named Lewis Powell, a tobacco lawyer in Virginia. He's hired by the Chamber of Commerce to write a plan to get the Chamber of Commerce more involved in politics. And Powell is outraged by the civil rights movement, by Hollywood, by the state of the media, by what's happening on political campuses, on college campuses during Vietnam. He is horrified by Martin Luther King. And Lewis Powell, in many ways, has the exact same reputation as John Roberts, and yet holds many of the same horrific views on race. What Powell says is the right has got to get more involved in picking judges. And he says, if we can take over a judiciary, that is the way to really control American life. This memo gets Powell himself named to the U.S. Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. So Powell is appointed to the court in the early 1970s and serves until the early 1990s. And what Powell advises as far as building conservative institutions in order to structure power for the long term, this memo is an inspiration to Charles Koch, who talks about it by name in speeches in the 1970s. All of the major conservative foundations and donors, this is where the Heritage Foundation, where that brought us Project 2025. It's where the American Enterprise Institute and Heritage, the Scaife Foundation, Joseph Coors. It's where all of the conservative billionaires who had been giving money to conservative causes for decades decide to come together in a really organized way and to actually build institutions to grow power over the long term. And in many ways, it's the Powell memo and memos that came afterwards that give you the Federalist Society, that give you all of these power building organizations that have been so successful as we look back 50 years later in creating the kind of nation we live in right now. And the point I'm trying to make really is that when you combine the kind of redistricting and the gerrymanders that have tilted control of state legislatures and Congress toward Republicans, and then when you combine that with control over the U.S. Supreme Court and the strategies that conservatives have used in the circuit courts, the lower federal courts, that knitted together becomes this huge double knot of unfairness built to advantage conservatives and Republicans that has in many ways created the current situation of American minority rule that we face in so many institutions and in so many states.
And this plot And they have locked up the legislative branches on the state and federal levels, but they've locked up the judiciary on the state and federal levels, the appeals. So when you find something wrong and you want to take it through the courts, the odds are stacked against you, which to me is of tremendous consequence when we're dealing with deportations. People are being disappeared. People are being taken out of the country, David Daley.
Right.
I mean, and maybe they'll be permanent residents, perhaps never to return. I don't know. And when you talk about this 50-year plot, I mean, were they looking at all facets of American life? Well, I mean, is there anything that they didn't want to touch?
I mean, if you look at the plans that Leonard Leo has right now, he's looking to expand his control over the world of culture and media as well. So no, I think that and he now controls a $1 billion plus dark money slush fund that, thanks to John Roberts and this court and the Citizens United ruling, is very hard to track what they are up to. So, this has been the most far-reaching effort to, we are not in this place by accident.
Mm.
And I think what's important for people to understand is that Donald Trump did not put us here. Our problem is not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is part of the American political problem. But he is not the cause of, he is not at the structural root of what ails our politics. What ails our politics is the fact that so many of these institutions, whether the courts, Congress, state legislatures, the popular vote, have been corrupted and tilted against majority rule. Donald Trump could leave the scene tomorrow, and that does not change. The conservative control over the courts is likely to last well into the 2050s, maybe even into the 2060s. These gerrymanders in states like Wisconsin and North Carolina are deep into their second decade and show no sign of letting up. The structural problems in the US Senate are only going to worsen. By 2035, it is said that 70% of Americans are going to live in 15 states. So they'll have 30 senators, right? And that small other piece of the country will have 70. They'll effectively have a break over a veto over anything that large majorities want to do. When we do reapportionment after the 2030 census and House seats move from the states that are losing population to the states that are gaining population, those seats are going to go to Florida and Texas and North Carolina and Arizona, states that have been gerrymandered, and they're going to come from California and New York. So these are seats where majorities have elected Democrats, and they're going to go to states that have been wired so that even when majorities prefer Democrats, they still get Republicans. And of course, that has a consequence on the Electoral College as well, because that's how you get electors, right? You add up the number of House members and US senators from a state. So there is a large amount of political power, structural power, that is shifting in the direction of those who have already rigged and wired so much of the system for their benefit.
But we're already seeing it in the
We're already
2024
seeing it.
election, right? There were fewer than, it was like 1.5%, fewer than 2 percentage points that separated Vice President Harris and then former President Trump in the popular vote. But there was this chasm that separated them in the Electoral College. Can you explain that?
Yeah, right. So you can win a state by 10,000 votes, but you take all of the electors. And really what ends up happening is that 6 or 7 states have all of the say. The 6 or 7 swing states get all of the attention. Every other state effectively is ignored. And so whether or not you show up in those states, the margin doesn't really matter. You know, in Illinois, where you are, or in Massachusetts, where I am, it just doesn't make a difference. But if we had a national popular vote and every vote actually mattered, I think you would see a different kind of campaign. You'd see different kinds of issues. And on the one office that all of us elect together, we would all actually have say, instead of it being, just Arizona and Georgia and Wisconsin making this decision for everybody by the slenderest of margins, right? I mean, back in 2020, when Joe Biden won the Electoral College, and his victory was pretty resounding in 2020, 7.5 million votes. But if about 45,000 votes in 3 states had moved, you would have had Donald Trump be president instead, even with a popular vote mandate going the other way. And I think what's so important to recognize as we talk about what reapportionment will look like in the next decade, in the 2024 election, Kamala Harris would have won the White House had she held the solid blue states, had she won the so-called blue wall states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and had she won the blue oasis in the Omaha, Nebraska seat. That would have gotten her to 270. But when we reapportion and when these seats go from California and New York and Michigan and Minnesota to Florida and Arizona and Texas, that's not enough anymore. In 2032, any Democratic candidate, if these projections hold, is going to have to win those states that we already named plus something else. They're going to have to win those states plus Georgia to get over 270, or those states plus North Carolina, or those states plus Arizona and Nevada together to get to 270. So the road for Democrats, not in this next campaign, but in the one after, is going to be markedly more difficult than it is right now.
And so the second part two of your book, and I'm so glad that I was able to read it, because I can understand your intentions in breaking this plot into 3 segments, which brings us to the second: control the law, remake the land. And it's not let the law be not, the law is a living, breathing thing. I mean, as laws change, as we change, right? No, they want control of the law, and they plan to remake the land, and they're doing that. Remaking the land into what?
I think that what this comes down to is that there are forces that are not comfortable with a multiracial nation being a multiracial democracy. And really, in many ways, what we're looking at is the same currents that have have held forth in American politics since the very beginning, right? When the vote was given to a handful of white men of power, property, and privilege. It becomes a question of who holds power and who is allowed to hold power, and who is kept voiceless, and where are the barriers. When you take a look at this Voter Suppression Act that passed through the House today, and some of the things that are included in there that will make it more difficult for people to vote, right? You look at how 69 million women who have gotten married but not perhaps changed the legal name on their driver's license or on their passport because that's complicated and expensive sometimes, right? Those 69 million people are going to have an additional barrier put in front of them at the ballot box if this moves through the Senate and is signed into law. That's not a barrier that men are going to face. When you look at the forms of ID that have been specifically required by states like Texas and North Carolina and elsewhere, voter ID is like John Roberts, right? It sounds like, well, of course I have to show ID to get on a plane or to get into an R-rated movie or to buy, cough medicine. So why shouldn't I have to show ID to vote, right? But the reality of it is a little bit different because, it's not as if any ID is good enough to vote, because these state legislatures, after being allowed by John Roberts in the Shelby County decision to pass laws that they would not have been able to pass previously, Roberts says, well, things have changed. And in the first hour that he assures us that things have changed, these states are passing laws that require IDs that they've already researched and proven that hundreds of thousands of Latinos and Blacks and other racial minorities in these states do not have. So they went ahead and they intentionally picked the forms of ID that they thought people did not have in order to build additional barriers to the ballot box. That's what this is about. This is about who gets to vote and who does not get to vote. It's not Jim Crow anymore, right? It's not, I'm going to murder you and your family if you show up to vote, so you'd better not register. It's, I'm just going to make it slowly harder and harder and harder every step of the way until maybe one of these barriers stops you. It's not Jim Crow anymore. It's Dr. James Crow, and he's got a PhD in mathematics and statistics, and he's going to figure this out, and it's going to look very neutral, but it's not actually neutral.
And where it seems like the more things change, the more they stay the same,
unfortunately.
And I'm not going to say that things have not changed. I think that,
well, of course,
people have changed.
Yes.
But people need to know what is going on. Oftentimes, and I'm so glad that you emphasize the point that Donald Trump is not the problem. See, because what Donald Trump did, or whoever helped him to make the decisions or made the decisions for him, because there's a lot going on, as we all know in politics, he got a young crew. Elon Musk is young. J.D. Vance is 40. That's it. With him is a new generation who have another 40 years at least in them of public life. And they are remaking the world as we know it. And it's I don't want people to feel hopeless, but I think that it's important for us to know what you're telling us, David, that these people have thought this through, and they were biding their time. They said, we'll let Roe v. Wade, we'll let Brown v. Board of Education, we'll let all that go through. Okay, okay, don't like it, I'll live with it. But in the meantime, they have the Bakke decision, which was really the beginning of the end of affirmative action. They have systematically, methodically,
which was our man Lewis Powell, by the way.
That's what I mean. I'm just saying, which goes to your point. And so in these last few minutes here, I want you to help us to understand where we are and where we need to be, because we're in a time of tremendous tumult. And it's very unsettling. But I think that if we have the information, that information is power. It's empowering. When you know that you're not crazy, that these folks have really set this in motion. Now, what do we need to set in motion? Like I said, we've got this open seat in Texas. I don't hear the Democrats saying anything about it.
No, it's really frustrating, right?
Yeah.
Because we have to be thinking about structural power and how to win back the levers of power the same way that the right did over the course of all of these decades. Democrats just spent $10 million trying to win one of these special elections in Florida in a seat that had been gerrymandered so badly that there was no chance that that seat was actually going to flip. And they proclaimed victory when it was only, 15 percentage points. Really, what they did was they lit $10 million of their of money donated through the Act Blue accounts of True Believers, and they just took it and lit it on fire and handed it to their consultants and pollsters and ad buyers. And this is how the Democratic Party turns. They make you think, oh, well, we're going to win this election, and that'll show them. Okay. And also, by the way, even if you'd won that election, it would have showed them nothing. But you weren't going to win that election. So what we need to do is to think about how you actually build back structural power. And that means we have to be building an agenda of what we need to do. And that means putting an end to gerrymandering. It means thinking about a U.S. House that is much more proportional rather than winner takes all. It means thinking about the national popular vote. It means thinking about how we fix the malapportioned U.S. Senate that gives the same amount of power to 700,000 people in Wyoming as it does to the millions of people who live in Los Angeles County alone. And it means fixing and right-sizing a U.S. Supreme Court that has been hijacked by rabid partisans and turned into a super legislature, completely unaccountable to the U.S. people. Excuse me. I mean, I start the book with a quote from Abraham Lincoln, which I think is worth a reading. And Lincoln says, "The candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon the vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers." And that really is what this is about. It's about whether the people still rule. It's about the consent of the governed. And here's what John Roberts has to say about that. This is Roberts on C-SPAN in 2009. "The most important thing for the public to understand is that we're not a political branch of government. They do not elect us. If they do not like what we are doing, it's more or less just too bad." And I think we all need to stand up and to tell John Roberts and all of these oligarchs and conservative billionaires and strategists who have hijacked our democracy that, it's not just too bad. We know what you are doing, acting as a political branch of the government. We see it, and we're not going to accept it anymore. This is still a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people, and we're going to take it back.
David DALEY, Antidemocratic, inside the far right's 50-year plot to control American elections. Everybody, please get this book. And I'm going to have you back to talk about it some more. Because when you talk about gerrymandering and changing the rules, I remember when my father ran for president both times. He was running for president, but he was also changing the rules. Because you got in there, particularly in 84, and you saw it was a winner-take-all system. You could win 49.999% of the vote, and you got no delegates. So he ended up running a parallel campaign. Where are my delegates? Give me my delegates. That was in 84.
Yeah.
You couldn't have, you had to have a proportion.
And then they're like, no, in which case, now we're going to have super delegates.
Yes. So that's what, that was the Democrats' answer.
Yeah, because... Yeah.
We don't trust the people, or certainly we don't want the people to have the ultimate say.
We're just going to add a little extra say here for ourselves.
Well, you know what? I think that because we are waking up and more of us are beginning, you know what? I'm so glad that we're living through this time, David Daly, because at least we're beginning to see. The quiet part is being said out loud. The covers have been taken off of the bed. We now see what's up under there, and that's important. And there is no, you are not out of your mind. It's a 50-year plot. The far right, they are very organized and they are very, very serious. And we need to be serious too. And quite honestly, this is not about right and left. This is about right and wrong. Do you want the country to be free? Do you want us to have our liberties? Do you want us to have our civil liberties? We're the ones who hold the answers. We're the ones. Get this book, Anti-Democratic. It makes it very easy. It's a trilogy. Rat Eft, Unrigged, Anti-Democratic. I'm making it easy for you guys. If you want to see what we're living with, and if you really want to understand the work that we've got to do, please support David Daly's books. He is a gift. I am Santita Jackson, AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota.